Where did Sinbad sail? It may be that the reply of many is, Who cares? And it lieth not in my power to make any one care by force or constraint. But it may be I may be able to awaken the interest of those whose interests slumber. May it be. If we do not all recall to mind instantly the stories of Paul Bunyan, the giant lumberjack of the North Woods, at least I am sure we have all heard of them and of him. I believe that there exists in the minds of all of us, shall I say, a suspicion that Paul Bunyan did not really own a big blue ox named Babe, who measured, was it 40 axe handles and a plug of chewing tobacco between the horns? We suspect, I think, that no one else did either, though, to be sure, it is the plug of chewing tobacco which adds the touch of verisimilitude to what is an otherwise, if not bold, certainly an unconvincing narrative. But that does not in any way mean that there was never a Paul Bunyan, that there are no oxen, no axe-handles, no chewing tobacco, no cakes and ale, and certainly not that there are no North Woods. However, I brought in Paul Bunyan just by way of example. The story or stories of Sinbad the Sailor, to give him his most common name in our English language, are something else. And it is my premise that Sinbad did not just sail off on a sea of dreams, but onto one which may be, if we take the trouble, mapped and charted, and its islands and its shores more or less, perhaps, be pointed out with the forefinger of the hand. The landfalls of Ulysses or Odysseus in the Odyssey, though much discussed, leave us much perplexed. But the 1001 Nights, or the Arabian Nights, Alf Layla wa Layla in the original, although their voyages encompass much larger seas, date from much later days. And whatever dates these may be, one thing is certain sure. The adventures alleged of Sinbad were adventures in a time and realm of writing, and those of the Odyssey were not. Let us not, of course, make the mistakes made by many in the past. That true things may be written in a book cannot make true all things written in books, nor, to take the tally and turn it over, does one lie or 100 lies prove King David right when he said in his sorrow, "All men are liars." In a way, partly to correct myself, Sinbad did set off on a sea of dreams, but these dreams were based on fact. It may be appropriate to begin with a description of the house of Sinbad in his years of retirement. The source is the story of Sinbad of the Sea from the Arabian Nights. The scene is the city of Baghdad. A handsome mansion, presenting an appearance of joy and majesty, a grand chamber, in which were noblemen and great lords, and in it were all kinds of flowers, and all kinds of sweet scents, and varieties of dried and fresh fruits, together with abundance of exquisite viands, and beverage prepared from the fruits of the choicest grape vines. In it were also instruments of music and mirth, and varieties of beautiful slave girls, all ranged in proper order. And here is the description of old Sinbad himself. At the upper end of that chamber was a great and venerable man, in the sides of whose beard grey hairs had begun to appear. He was of handsome form, comely in countenance, with an aspect of gravity, and dignity, and majesty, and stateliness. Hardly some drunken and reprobate old sea-dog telling tall stories in return for a free beer and a bucket of slops, is it? We are in the world of the Arabian Nights, in which the real and the ideal mingle side by side. Whatever the actual date of the story, and in fact it would seem impossible not only to assign an actual date to it, but even to define what is meant by the actual date, it contains within it some actual memories of the golden age of Al-Islam, An age of tolerance and toleration, of prosperity and welcome contact with the outside world, a world in itself very wide-ranging, with commerce unchecked by ignorance or avarice. And of this world the de facto capital is Baghdad, successor to Babylon, as yet unravished by the Mongol hordes, and of which the de facto ruler is the legendary Caliph Harun al-Rashid, whose name, it may be said, translates as Aaron the Righteous. Wealth is appreciated, poverty is understood, both being the gifts assigned by the infinite wisdom of— but allow me to give the epigraph itself. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, praise be to God, the beneficent King, the Creator of the universe, who hath raised up the heavens without pillars, and spread out the earth as a bed. And blessing and peace be upon the Lord of Apostles, our Lord and our Master Mohammed, and his family. Blessing and peace, enduring and constant unto the day of judgment. To proceed. The lives of former generations are a lesson to posterity, that a man may review the remarkable events which have happened to others, and be admonished, and may consider the history of people of preceding ages, and of all that hath befallen them, and be restrained. Extolled be the perfection of him who hath thus ordained the history of former generations to be a lesson to those which follow. Such are the tales of 1001 Nights, with their romantic stories and their fables. The actual framework of the 1001 Nights is merely that, a framework. You all know it. How there was once a king who, shocked at discovering his wife's infidelity, decided to give no subsequent wife time or chance to be unfaithful. He married a fresh one each evening, and put her to death each morning. To call this grotesque and cruel is to say that water wets and fire burns. Finally, he married the clever Scheherazade, who spun him a story which lasted until morning, until the hour of execution of the inevitable death sentence, and then she broke off the story. The king, Shahryar by name, unable to give up the chance of finding out how the story came out, decided to wait until the next morning. But Scheherazade did not wait. She finished the first story before daybreak, and immediately began a new one. And somehow, by the dawn of the next day, she had not finished that one either. Is there here some faint echo of faithful Penelope, weaving her web of tapestry, telling the impetuous and clamorous suitors that she would indeed choose one of them to succeed the long-lost Odysseus as her husband as soon as the tapestry should be finished, and then each night unravelling what she had woven the preceding day? It may be so. There are certainly elements of the Odyssey in the stories of Sinbad himself. At any event, Scheherazade kept the game up for 1001 nights, hence the title of the collection, the anthology we might call it, at which time King Shahryar gave up and pardoned her. Where did she get all those fascinating stories? Is it vain to ask? It is vain to ask if there really was a Homer. It is certain that there was no Scheherazade. The language of the stories is Arabic, hence the other title of the Arabian Nights. I do not know what the present attitude toward them may be in current Arabic literary circles, but in times past the Arabic man of letters looked down upon them all, and despised them as being mere bizarre fables from Persia and India and who knew where. To ask them their opinion was akin to asking an expert on, say, Wordsworth or Blake his opinion of comic books. The stories, in fact, came from everywhere, not only from the East, but from the West as well. They may have assumed roughly their present outlines as early as 1,000 years ago in Baghdad. They were certainly extensively worked over in Egypt, and our present version dates from early in the 18th century. Soon after, they were introduced into Europe via French translations, and, as has often been the case, were passed on to later generations in bowdlerized and abridged versions as stories for children. The same happened to Gulliver's Travels, and to Moby Dick, to Robinson Crusoe, to— Children appreciate a good story. They don't inquire about symbolism or archetypes, and they never read critics. The unexpurgated versions would very likely amuse them just as much, but our current attitudes do not permit of our reading to them or letting them read for themselves such little nuggets as "The Night that Abu Hassan Farted." The stories of Sinbad the Sailor, however, require very little pruning, and they have already had it, so what follows will not bring a blush to the chastest cheek. Onward. Sinbad, he tells us, was the son of a rich merchant there in Baghdad, in the old land of Babylonia, called by the Greeks Mesopotamia. Well, he doesn't tell us all this. I tell us all this, in case you might think otherwise that Baghdad is in, say, Alabama or Arkansas. Mesopotamia, between the rivers, because this once so rich land lay between the Tigris and Euphrates. The rivers join downstream and flow into the Persian Gulf, which in turn enters the Indian Ocean. And he, Sinbad, inherited wealth and buildings and fields, and, in short, he blew it all on easy living. Well, not quite all. When he had come to his senses, he sold what remained, and found himself with 3,000 pieces of silver. And, he says at that time, it occurred to my mind to travel to the countries of other people, and I arose and bought for myself goods and commodities and merchandise, with such other things as were required for travel, and my mind had consented to my performing a sea voyage. Now, Sinbad does not tell us here what goods and commodities and merchandise he bought for himself, but the matter is not beyond conjecture. There are old sources which list trade items to and from Baghdad, in those days, in what is now called Iraq, and it may be of interest to mention several of them. Figured linen, balsam, textile dyes, grain, fruit, carpets, brocades, muslin, silks wrought with gold, damask and velvet, the best dates in the world, mandrake, indigo, white slaves, beeswax, wool, unicorns' horns, ostrich feathers, pedigreed she-camels, felt, gems, incense, papyrus, armour, musk, fur, very sweet sugar-cane, paper, truffles, candied capers, zithers, arrowheads, prunes, combs, honey, fruit syrups, axes, parasols, lead, linen, rosewater, glass, jasmine, pistachios, dancing girls, eunuchs, striped cloth, figs, vinegar sauces. The list goes on like a litany. Motto, if you don't see it, ask for it. Sinbad continues. I am using Lane's translation here, unless otherwise stated. I embarked on a ship, and it descended to the city of Basra with a company of merchants, and we traversed the sea for many days and nights. What were they like, the ships on which Sinbad sailed? They were nothing like the European galleons with the carven cabined poops, as shown in many illustrations. They were almost certainly of the class of vessels called dhows, and perhaps pronounced zows, with which the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and other waters of the Asian/African continents have been traversed since semi-ancient times. Let me cite the short entry in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, the 1962 edition. The famous earlier 11th edition is certainly the best, but mine has suffered from fire and flood and storms and travels and travails, et n'existe plus. Dhow, a type of vessel used throughout the Arabian Sea. The language to which the word belongs is unknown. Used of any craft along the East African coast, it is usually applied to the vessel of about 150 to 200 tons burden, with a stem rising with a long slope from the water. Dhows generally have one mast with a lateen sail, the yard being of enormous length. Much of the coasting trade of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf is carried by these vessels. They were the regular vessels employed by the Arabs in the slave trade from the east coast of Africa. Captain Allen Villiers, the most famous master of old forms of sailcraft in our time, he sailed the replicas of the Mayflower and the Golden Hind across the ocean, has written a book about the various kinds of dhows as were still to be found in the 1930s. Although he depicts them as being efficient for such purposes as bringing mangrove poles from East Africa to Saudi Arabia and even up to Bahrain at the upper Persian Gulf, there is little glamorous about them in his narrative, unless the word glamorous be defined other than usually. They were caulked with shark oil and stank abominably. It is as well to forget such details in order to enjoy the lustre and sparkle of the stories of the 1001 Nights. My friends L. Sprague de Camp and Willie Lee have a reference to them in their own book, Lands Beyond. It is also brief, so let me quote. I may as well tell you that the chapter being quoted is called The Sea of Sinbad, and I had really forgotten about having read it around 25 years ago. However, on realizing that I'd started to cover, so to speak, the same ground, or water, I decided to go ahead anyway, and, in fact, to quote it when appropriate. So, herewith. The first voyage of Sinbad, like all the others, begins with a minor overland or river trip from Baghdad to Basra, the seaport at the head of the Persian Gulf. Thence Sinbad embarked. So far the trip is commonplace. The hearers know all about these trading voyages down the coast of Fars, Persia, that is, or Iran, and beyond, on which the lateen-rigged dhows of the Arab maritime world were constantly setting forth, as they still do. However, by this literary device the author, like those of the Odyssey, gets his hero away from the known and the normal, to far places where the strange and the monstrous are to be expected. Remember that to the hearer Baghdad was the humdrum world of every day, not the land of the exotic and fantastic. On they went, south and east, under their bellying trapezoidal sails, pretty things and efficient to light breezes, but the devil's own work to tack with. I have said that the united Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow into the Persian Gulf, and that this enters the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean, with its confluent seas, rolls its waves from Africa in the west to Australia in the east, and laves the shores of continents, subcontinents, archipelagos, and solitary islands and peninsulas alike. The ships and boats of men have crossed and recrossed these waters since the most ancient times. The monsoon winds blew them at established seasons, first in one direction, then, months later, another. Trade routes had been set up, but time and chance had happened to them all, and they did not stay set. What had been certain and familiar in one century had often become lost or confused or fabulous in another. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, composed 800 years or so earlier than the earliest version of the Arabian Nights, was a trade manual and navigation guide, into which, as it were despite itself, elements of romance had intruded. One might say of the stories of the voyages of Sinbad that, on the contrary, they were romances into which had intruded elements of trade and navigation. It remains to be seen to what extent we may part the gaudy curtains of its fictions and discern the lineaments of its facts. Where, indeed, did Sinbad sail? Remember that there was no magnetic compass yet to guide the sailor on the sea, and that, although something of latitude was known, it was to be another 900 years or so before a firm method of fixing longitude was to be available. Sometimes, I have said, the ships went where the winds blew them. That is, you could make your way down into the paths of the monsoon in the spring and sail with full sails all the way to India or Ceylon. In September the monsoon would blow you back the other way. However, for the most part, or as far as other parts and other seasons were concerned, you sailed either by dead reckoning or by guess and by God. In effect, dead reckoning means sailing from one landmark to another, aided by a record of how many days' sail between them. Man proposes, but God disposes, and you did not always wind up where you had set out to go, assuming that you knew exactly where you had set out to go. There were storms, rocks, reefs, shoals. There were pirates, errors. In a time even much, much later, and in another and a much smaller sea, whose routes were incomparably better known, a Turkish fleet set out for the island of Malta, a mere half-way across the Mediterranean, and returned much sooner than expected. To the surprised inquiry as to how things were going on in Malta, the Turkish admiral replied succinctly, "Malta yok." There isn't any Malta, or Malta isn't there. There were calms, times when there was no wind, but Sinbad's narrative mentions none of this. "We had passed island after island," says he, as he tells, likelier retells, his sea stories to all the high-class guests in his lordly chamber. And, as they are cracking his pistachio nuts, and eating his figs and dates, and roast mutton and chicken pilaf, and washing their fingers in his rose-water, and ogling his pretty dancing girls all the time he is talking, one may imagine that no one is uncouth enough to interrupt him and demand, "Yes, that's all very well, Sinbad Effendi, but just what islands were those?" Not bloody likely, no. "We had passed island after island, and from sea to sea, and from land to land, and in every place by which we passed we sold and bought and exchanged merchandise." Business, after all, is business. But to intrude and ask, "How much did taffeta fetch by the yard in them islands?" None of your business. A young man, tired of hearing young Ernest Hemingway talk about the French women, this and that, interposed and asked, "How old are the French women, Hem?" But that was in another country. Well, actually, Sinbad's first adventure is pretty old hat, or should one say turban. You all know it. The ship tied up to an island, and most everybody went ashore to stretch their legs, and cook their rice with cumin seeds, and wash their pyjamas. Lo, it was not a real island after all. It was a great fish, which had lain there so long, part submerged, that grass and trees had grown upon it. Troubled by the heat of the campfires, down it went. And by the time Sinbad had surfaced and climbed into a wash-tub and begun to paddle with his feet, like Gollum, away went the ship, sails spread, and no roll-call or muster taken. Too bad, Sinbad. A Western scholar, checking this story with a venerable Arab sheikh in the last century, found that the story was well known. The sheikh assured him that it was recounted, though not in the name of Sinbad, in sources whose authenticity was not to be denied. The one point on which the sages differed, the sheikh said, smoothing his beard, was whether or not the sea creature was a giant turtle or a whale. Where does this leave us? We may somewhat safely say that giant sea turtles are not found off the coast of Iceland, and that whales are unknown in the Rio Grande. Otherwise your guess is as good as mine. As for another explanation for the island which sank, de Camp suggests that evidently somebody correlated the reports of the big monsters of the sea and the disappearing and reappearing islands, which were such a hazard to coastal navigation, apparently finding it easier to believe in drifting sea monsters than in small sandy islands shifted about by currents between one high tide and the next. Easier, and more interesting. Meanwhile, back to Sinbad the sailor, still paddling in his wooden wash-tub. By and by he came to another island, where he disembarked, and met up with a man who had tethered a beautiful mare to the shore. Both man and mare were astonished to see him. The mare merely whinnied with a great cry, but the man was more verbose. Said he, "Know that we are the grooms of the King El-Miraj. Every month, when the moonlight commenceth, we bring the swift mares, every mare that has not foaled, that they may attract the sea-horses." This part of the story is perhaps a bit better provided with geographical coordinates. For one thing, the King El-Miraj, in other editions of the Arabian Nights his name is written as El-Marajan, there is little doubt that this is simply a form of the Indian word Maharaja, or Great King. This would not help us very much, there having been perhaps hundreds of rulers who have used this title, but more of that later. Let us first consider the seahorse, but let us not consider him very much. The medieval Arab writer El-Kazwini, or El-Kazini, he who said that the sea tortoise is so enormous that the people of the ship imagine it to be an island, informs us that sometimes a foal is produced having a water-horse for its sire and a land-mare for its dam. He adds that the water-horse is black and lives in the Nile. How Sinbad got into the Nile we are perhaps not meant to know, but it is alas too likely that someone had too literally translated the Greek hippopotamus, the horse of the river, and the rest follows. Sinbad has clearly been fibbing here. Sigh. There is, however, or so it seems, at least a faint echo of another traveller's tale. And since it was probably told on the authority of 6 learned Greeks and 7 erudite Arabs, all with long names difficult to read, hard to pronounce, and impossible to spell, I'll skip them, shall I? Good. Briefly, it is to this effect. There is a place where the horse breeders take their mares, when the west wind blows, in order that they may become pregnant by this wind, and produce swift foals. And if you doubt this, consider the fact that the west wind's very name is mentioned, to wit, Aquilo, the eagle's swift. Are you still sceptical? Then consider the evidence compiled from old sources by Mr. Clark Firestone, as follows. Male sheep are conceived when the north-east wind blows, and females when the south wind blows, according to the Tartars, who call the wind the foal who courses round the earth. If sheep, why not horses? Ha-ha! You cannot answer, bowled over as you are by my remorseless logic. Well, having told you not only the name of the randy-daddy of these colts, let me cite an authority whom you had better not dismiss, videlicet Pliny the Elder. In the vicinity of Olisipo and the river Tagus, the mares, by turning their faces towards the west wind as it blows, become impregnated by its breezes, and the foals thus conceived are remarkable for their fleetness, but they never live beyond 3 years. To which one might add, and neither doth the wind that gets 'em. Why one wind should wish to commit dalliance with sheep, and another prefer horses, I cannot say. There is no accounting for tastes, as the old woman said when she kissed her pig. But where, you may ask, and justly so, is Olisipo? If you do, you will expose ignorance in more than merely old-time geography. For the river Tagus is still in Portugal, and Olisipo is merely an old name for Lisbon, which, it has been said, was founded by Ulysses. Another old salt in no great hurry to get home, and in his own right the source of many a tall, tall tale. Does this then mean that Sinbad, having somehow gotten into the Nile, and perhaps figuring that the Egyptian lady horses would have no objections to a night of love with a hippo for pity's sake, somehow followed the advice of Columbus, to wit, sail on, and wound up on the coast of Portugal? Who knows? Who knows, for that matter, why the mares turned their faces toward the west wind in order to become pregnant by it? Odd, very, very odd. Wonders never cease. By the way, who was this fellow whom I quote from time to time, Al-Kazwini, or, as Lane, author of Customs of the Modern Egyptians, modern as distinct from ancient, the book was written during the 1840s, spells it El-Kazwini? Again I bring in a paragraph from De Camp. The Arab storytellers could likewise point to a scientific book by one of their own people, which had great authority among them. Its author, Mahmud al-Kazwini, is now chiefly remembered for his remark that the greatness of Allah can be deduced from the fact that he, lets the rain fall only on fruitful land, and not on the desert, where nothing would grow anyway. But he was for a long time the chief authority on things zoological in the Muslim world. He died in 1283, about 9 years after the completion of his book Ajaib al-Makhlukat, which may be translated as Wonders of Animate Creation. However, back to Sinbad, who says, "And I saw in the dominions of the king El-Miraj an island called Kasil, in which is heard the beating of tambourines and drums throughout the night, and the islanders informed us that Ed-Dajjal is in it." Who is Ed-Dajjal? He is, says De Camp, Al-Dajjal, the Muslim Antichrist. A hint? You bet. Our old Arab friend El-Kazwini does speak of an island called Kabil, not indeed quite the same as Kasil, but prior to the age of dictionaries it was evidently against almost everyone's religion to spell a name the same way twice. We have, after all, only 6 signatures of Shakespeare, and he wrote his own name 6 different ways, I'm told. Hoyts you? So let's say that Kasil and Kabil are the same, because, furthermore, what says El-Kaz of Kabil? Listen. In it are heard by night the sounds of drums and tambourines, and disturbing cries, and disagreeable laughter, and the sailors say that Ed-Dajjal is in it, and that he will come forth from it. So the next time I hear such sounds, I won't just assume that it's a rock concert. I'll know that it is Ed-Dajjal and his bunch whooping it up prior to coming forth to lay waste the earth. How's your mom, Ed? Quoting one of them matter-of-fact people who won't let nobody have no fun, Lane says that he says of the island Kasil/Kabil, the roaring of the waves amongst its hollow rocks might not improbably have resembled the sound of drums. This fellow quoted is a Mr., would you believe it, Hole. Double, Well, but where does all this lead us, if anywhere? Patience. We consult the wise men of Arabia and its circumjacent coasts in the olden times. They knew a thing or two. They say that Kabil was a possession of the king of Zanij, that another name for Zanij was Raneh, and that the king of Raneh was named El-Miraj. Well! And Mr. Lane, the translator of the 1001 Nights, suggests that Zanij or Raneh was Borneo, and he proves it by sundry other proofs. But I, for one, will take his word. Sinbad was in Borneo. No hippos, true, but what the hell, man can't have everything. Why, then, did the later editors of the Arabian Nights, when they kept adding good stuff to it, the latest funny story heard in the big bazaar, or an appropriate poem that their brother-in-law had just written, Why didn't they add it, as it were as an aside, Sinbad was really in Borneo? Maybe because they never put two and two together, and maybe they were afraid it might spoil the story and make it too realistic, and of course, maybe they just didn't care. Are there really no canals on Mars? Not even one? Only one? Not— Well, before long, and after all, there is Sinbad back in Baghdad again. The Big Apple. Can't stay away, it seems. The old home town. Don't knock it if you haven't tried it. Mameluke, another cup of kawa, and put just a tinsy bit more ambergris in it this time. Say, you fellows, did I ever tell you about the time when I myself was ever so much younger, say about the latter part of the administration of Franklin Pierce, there was still being sung a song of which I can remember only the words, which are in fact the title. How are you gonna keep 'em down on the farm after they've seen Paris? In Sinbad's case, however, he already was in Paris, so to speak. I am afraid that there was in the soul of Sinbad a good deal of the spirit of the travelling salesman, and I think, too, that Jack Kerouac's On the Road would have met with instant understanding on Cindy's part. In a way, there really was a Sinbad, sort of. His name was Mohammed Ibn Battuta, and he was a Berber, a native of northwest Africa. If anything, as far as time and territory are involved, he out-Sinbaded Sinbad. I believe that he spent something like 34 years in travelling from Morocco to China and back again. The only trouble is that he, for one thing, lived hundreds of years after the putative time of Sinbad. The other trouble is that he didn't draw the longbow near as much. Perhaps he had been influenced by Sinbad. Perhaps he was a reincarnation. Even if you have never heard of him, you have heard of anyway one of his stories under the name of the Indian rope trick. Evidently Ibn Battuta was the first to mention it in writing. I'm tempted to bring in Ibn Battuta right along here because of his Sinbadian parallels, or whatever, and also because his life experiences are so exceedingly interesting. But I think I'll withstand the temptation, and perhaps employ him or them another time, perhaps in an adventure entitled The Man Who Was Sinbad the Sailor. Perhaps, and perhaps not. Now, I shall not, from here, invariably be giving the adventures of Sinbad in the invariable and same order in which they appear in the Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1001 Nights. For one thing, it really makes no difference as far as the original account goes. The tales do not in any way hang one upon another. And for another reason, that is, I want to save what I think is the most interesting discovery for the last. And partly this is because, partly, it is my own discovery. Have you purchased your goods and merchandise, then? Is your sea bag all packed? Your life insurance paid up? Yes? Good. All ashore that's going ashore, and onward. The vessel proceeded with us, confiding in the blessing of God, whose name be exalted, over the roaring sea agitated with waves, and the voyage was pleasant to us, and we ceased not to proceed in this manner for a period of days and nights, from island to island and from sea to sea, until a contrary wind rose against us one day. In short, the inevitable shipwreck is about to happen. They were almost compulsory in travel narratives, and were indeed fairly common. I have been shipwrecked, or at any rate boat-wrecked, upon an, as it so happened, desert island myself. It is no joke. However, let us skip about a bit. Aha! The third voyage. Cindy and his friends are attacked in their ship by the inhabitants of the Mountain of Apes, termed in some editions the Island of Apes. The apes, in fact, captured the ship and drove the sailing men ashore. As if that was not bad enough, they met up with a giant, tusks like the tusks of swine, a mouth of prodigious size, and he had ears like 2 mortars, some texts say like 2 barges, hanging down upon his shoulders. This giant is, alas, a cannibal, and kills and spits and roasts and eats sundry of Sinbad's comrades in much the same manner as the Cyclops Polyphemus eats the comrades of Ulysses in the Odyssey. And when we read further that Sinbad had his comrades heat great sticks in the fire, and blind their giant, and so make their escape, just as did Ulysses, who had only one eye to deal with, then we may suspect that somebody had been reading the Odyssey. Probably not the second giant, though. This in itself, then, gives us no hint as to where Sinbad sailed. But what about the rest of it? Well, no less an authority than the learned Ibn el-Waradi informs us that the island of the apes is large, and in it are marshy forests and numerous apes. Those who come to them in ships they torture with biting and scratching and stoning, but the people of the 2 islands of Kartan and Martan employ stratagems against them. The learned Mr. Lane suggests that the 2 islands of Kartan and Martan are actually one island, and adds, "I think that it is Sumatra," and I think so too. And when we learn that our Mr. Marsden, not otherwise described, other than that he is quoted by the equally mysterious Mr. Hole, informs us that the inhabitants of Nias bore their ears, the lower parts being stretched till they touch the shoulders, we are at once reminded that the ears of Sinbad's cannibal giant were also hanging down upon his shoulders. And where is the island of Nias? Mr. Marsden informs us, adjacent to Sumatra. That clinches it. Sumatra is one of the immense islands of what used to be the Dutch East Indies, and are now the Republic of Indonesia, and Sinbad was there. Where else was he? He is kind enough to inform us that he was in the island of Serendip, which we already understand to be an old name for Ceylon, which now has a new name, Sri Lanka. And by means of comparing old names with newer names, and by comparing geographical descriptions with geographical facts, it seems reasonable to conclude that he was also in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the Indian Ocean. It also seems that he was in sundry islands of the Straits of Sunda, again in what is now Indonesia, and that he was several times in Sumatra, again. And on one of his voyages he seems to have discovered the elephant's graveyard, and, so far as I know, no one discovered it before him, and no one really since. We now come to the concluding incident in this adventure, although, as I indicated earlier, it is not the concluding one in the voyages as they appear in the text of the Arabian Nights. I have omitted the story of the Valley of Diamonds because it did not take place on or near the sea. Suffice it to say that the same story appears in the travels of Messer Marco Polo and those of Sir John de Mandeville, and that, as for the practice of cutting up sheep and throwing the pieces into an inaccessible gorge where diamonds stuck to them, in order to raid the nests of birds who had picked up the meat with the precious stones still sticking to it, why, has any shade of confirmation of this otherwise great yarn ever come to my attention? Listen. Still more wonderful is the mode in which the Arabians collect the cinnamon. Where the wood grows and what country produces it they cannot tell, only some, following probability, relate that it comes from the country in which Bacchus was brought up. Great birds, they say, bring the sticks, which we Greeks, taking the word from the Phoenicians, call cinnamon, and carry them up into the air to make their nests. These are fastened with a sort of mud to a sheer face of rock, where no foot of man is able to climb. So the Arabians, to get the cinnamon, use the following artifice. They cut all the oxen and asses and beasts of burthen that die in their land into large pieces, which they carry with them in those regions, and place near the nests. Then they withdraw to a distance, and the old birds, swooping down, seize the pieces of meat, and fly with them up to their nests, which, not being able to support the weight, break off and fall to the ground. Hereupon the Arabians return and collect the cinnamon, which is afterwards carried from Arabia into other countries. Where was this from? From our supposedly sceptical old friend Herodotus. Book 3 is where. Got to hand it to them Arabs. A nosy Westerner asks them the source of the expensive cinnamon of Ceylon, so why, naturally, they spin him a story to make your eyes dizzy. It worked. Oh, bless your beard, it worked. And over 1,000 years later, being asked equally none-of-your-business questions about the source of the diamonds of India, they spun the same story, and it still worked. Verily, all foreigners are mad. In the book, this is the second voyage of Sinbad of the sea. Know, O my brothers, that I was enjoying a most comfortable life, and the most pure happiness, until it occurred to my mind one day to travel again to the lands of other people, and I felt a longing for the occupation of traffic, that is, trade, and the pleasure of seeing countries and islands of the world, and gaining my subsistence. Clearly Sinbad was not one of those who were meant to live over a linoleum store. I resolved upon that affair, and, having taken forth from my money a large sum, I purchased with it goods and merchandise suitable for travel, and packed them up. Again he fails to inform us what goods and merchandise they were, and again we are obliged to guess. Olive oil, nutmegs, saffron, yellow and striped broadcloth, pigs of iron and pigs of lead, pearls bored for necklaces, golden rings with red carnelians, or even, perhaps, ivory, apes and peacocks. Qui sabe? Onward. Then I went to the banks of the river, and found a handsome new vessel, with sails of comely canvas, and it had a numerous crew, and was superfluously equipped. So I embarked my bales in it, as did also a party of merchants besides, and we set sail that day. The voyage was pleasant to us, and we ceased not to pass from sea to sea and from island to island, and at every place where we cast anchor we met the merchants and the grandees, and the sellers and the buyers, and we sold and bought and exchanged goods. Clearly Sinbad and his comrades of the voyage had a very sound grasp of the fact that, concerning international trade, if you don't buy, you can't sell. Thus we continued to do until destiny conveyed us to a beautiful island, abounding with trees bearing ripe fruits, where flowers distilled their fragrance, with birds warbling and pure rivers. But there was not an inhabitant nor a blower of a fire. This last phrase is rather vivid, isn't it, and brings to my mind a scene of long ago when on the island of Cyprus I first saw anyone pick up a hollow tube, and indeed blow through it to quicken the fire of carob wood with its fragrant scent and chestnut wood with its rosy heart. No doubt the scene brought back memories to Sinbad too, and he sat himself down and ate, and so, by and by, he became immersed in sleep, enjoying that sweet zephyr and the fragrant gales. I then arose, and found not in the place a human being nor a jinni. The vessel had gone with the passengers, and not one of them remembered me, neither any of the merchants nor any of the sailors, so they left me in that island. One is divided between demanding what island, and once more sighing, poor Sinbad. This was always happening to him. One wonders why he was so supremely forgettable, and one wonders if perhaps it was he who always won those poker games which while away the lonely hours to which sailors when at sea were so often subject. But be that as it may, he did what every sensible traveller does, once he realizes that he has been marooned or cast away. He climbed a tree. Now, at first, although he saw naught save the sky and water and trees and birds and islands and sands, that was not the end of it. Looking, however, with a scrutinizing eye, there appeared a white object of enormous size. Naturally, he shinned down the tree and trudged over to have a closer look. I am sure that you all by now remember what he finally found, to wit, a huge white dome of great height and large circumference. He had no idea what it was, until he saw coming straight down in his direction, hiding the sun and darkening the sky, an absolutely gigantic bird. And I remembered, said he, a story which travellers and voyagers had told me long before, that there is in certain of the islands a bird of enormous size, called the rook, that feedeth its young ones with elephants. I was convinced, therefore, that the dome which I had seen was one of its eggs. Well, here was a pretty pickle. Not, mind you, that the rook, or rock, itself ate elephants, which would have been quite bad enough, but that its young ate them. Whew, boy! Before he could make the effort to escape, which would probably have been most unwise, the rook landed on its colossal egg and settled down, and brooded over it with its wings, and slept. Did Sinbad worry as to what might happen if the damned thing ever hatched? Not a bit of it. He unwound his turban and twisted it like a rope, and tied himself to one of the birdie's big feet. In the morning, sure enough, up and away flew Rocky, and by came down to land, when see with what dispatch Sinbad untied himself. The rook, or rock, seized up a huge serpent in its claws, and flew away again in an instant. Sinbad, you will recall, now found himself in the Valley of the Diamonds, and as to his adventures and experiences there, enough. Question. Was there such a bird? If so, what? Question. Was there such an island? If so, which? Forget about the elephant bit. It is now clearly established that no bird can carry more than a few pounds weight, and it is also clearly established that the American condor, the few specimens which are left, with its maximum wingspan of about 14 feet, has absolutely the largest spread of any bird which flies, and it cannot even lift a normal-sized human baby. No bird which has ever lived could, by the laws of physics, lift even a baby elephant. So the whole thing must be simply one more whopper. Right? Right. Only maybe not. There are so many items which appear both in Sinbad and other places in the Arabian Nights and in the Book of Travels of Sir Marco Polo that one is often tempted to believe that one of them must have drawn upon another. What, if anything, says Messer Marco on the subject? Anything at all? You bet. Listen. The people of the island report that at a certain season of the year an extraordinary kind of bird, which they call a rook, makes its appearance, being so large and strong as to seize an elephant with its talons, and so forth, and so on. What are we to make of this? We are to make first a note that MP does not say he saw it himself. No. The people of the island report, etc. Okay. What island? The well-voyaged Venetian jewellery merchant says it is called Mogadixco, or something like that. Something is at once clearly wrong here. Mogadisco, in modern spelling, is not an island. It is a city on the mainland of Africa, and the present capital of Somalia. MP says that it has elephants. Well, it is in Africa, and Africa does have elephants. Africa has islands too, but none of the islands have elephants. Marco Polo has had a very good reception with scholars in general. If he says something, one is inclined to believe that it is so. But even Homer sometimes nods, so it need be no surprise that Polo also dozed at times. In short, he never went to Mogadixco, and his reports followed reports which were sadly incorrect in several places. One of the mistakes has gotten onto a map and given its name to an island, and the island's name takes the form of Madagascar, and Madagascar ain't got no elephants. It never did have. But at the time that Polo was writing, Madagascar did have people, yes, and Sinbad says that his island had no people, nor any blower of a fire. We've seen that the Arabian Nights, in one form or another, in its earlier form, that is, probably dates back to the 9th century. And in the 9th century, it seems, Madagascar may have had no people, nor any blower of a fire. And although it lies about 250 miles off the coast of Africa, the other side of the Mozambique Channel, and though the inhabitants on the Channel side seem to be in large part of African descent, it seems that they were not the original inhabitants. Who, then, were? The present people of the island have a tradition that a race of white dwarfs were, and it has been suggested that this referred to white lemurs. And it has been also said that it refers to the African Bushmen, who, though small, are not exactly dwarfs, and though light, are not white. Also, there is absolutely no evidence that they ever lived on Madagascar. The title of original inhabitants must therefore go to some other people, and for the moment I decline to drop the other shoe. My friend the late Willie Lee, of whom I could tell more than one jovial story, has in his book Exotic Zoology a chapter called The Island of the Man-Eating Tree. Let me quote his opening lines. Madagascar, 228,000 square miles in extent, is one of the world's largest islands, ranking fourth in size after Greenland, New Guinea, and Borneo. Some may wonder at the absence of Australia from the list, but of course Australia ranks as a continent. Some scientists have suggested, indeed, that the geology and flora and fauna of Madagascar are so different, so distinctive, that perhaps it too should be considered as a continent, small though it is. There are no large native animals. This was true of other islands late on the discovery list. For example, Iceland, New Zealand, and Mauritius, and it is rather curious that perhaps none of these places had any inhabitants at the time of the first collection of the Arabian Nights. It is sometimes, though only sometimes, typical of islands which lack either human inhabitants or large mammals that some of the native birds lose the power of flight, presumably because there are no dangerous creatures from which they need to escape by flying. It sometimes also happens that some of these birds grow to very large size. In Iceland it was the great auk, in New Zealand the moa, and in Mauritius the dodo. All of these birds are now extinct. Was it true of Madagascar as well? Yes, it was. When the first inhabitants arrived, they found its plains and valleys being grazed by what L. Sprague de Camp describes in his Lands Beyond as an emu-like bird about as tall as an ostrich, but much more massive, weighing up to 1,000 pounds. It is, in fact, the heaviest bird ever known to have lived. Now listen carefully. But its most distinctive attribute was not so much its size as the size of the eggs it laid, which are the biggest eggs any naturalist ever heard of. While they were not 50 paces in circumference, like those of Sinbad's rook, they had a capacity of 2.5 gallons, or 6 times that of an ostrich egg, and 150 times that of a chicken's egg. The scientific name is Aepionis ingens. This bird was certainly alive when Madagascar's first fleet landed about the year 900 or 1000, or perhaps earlier. They may even have been alive during the 17th century, when a Frenchman who had lived among the natives wrote, "There is a very large bird which hides in the woods." But they are certainly not alive now. Hiding in the woods did not, in the long run, help. However, so thick are the shells of their immense eggs that a number have survived, the eggs, not the birds, and in fact are sometimes still being found. If they are only partly broken, the Malagasy, the name of both the people and their republic, the island itself remains Madagascar, use them for storage purposes. If they are intact, the Malagasy regard them as sacred and sacrifice sheep to them. Only two more things before I go to establish the connection of the Rook or Rock with Madagascar. Marco Polo and certain old-time Arabic language writers mention that huge feathers from the Rook were sometimes seen in other countries. It is now agreed that these were actually the immense fronds from the Raphia or Raphia palm. Habitat, so to speak, of the Raphia palm? Answer, Madagascar. It is irrelevant, but I think interesting to recall that it was off the coasts of Madagascar, that great red island, that William Kidd, a master of craft, Captain Kidd, the Captain Kidd, that same, that Captain Kidd captured those ships for whose capture he was captured, as he sailed, for which he was sentenced to be hanged in chains on Executioner's Wharf, and his body to lie till 3 high tides had washed over it, the sentence being duly carried out. One of the British judges who condemned him was a Mr. Justice Turton. Some several years ago, and in what was then a British colony, I met a local planter, a Mr. Turton. "That's a well-known name," I remarked. He nodded without surprise. "Yes," he said, "I plant more great Cavendish bananas than any other man in the colony." Why, then, having clearly set forth the claim of Madagascar as the island of the rock, why do we speak of Ceylon? And what do you mean by murmuring, or even thinking who speaks of Ceylon? Have you already forgotten that Sinbad himself tells us that he was in Serendip, in other words, Ceylon? By the way, another form of the name was Serendip. Horace Walpole, whom I have described elsewhere as a kindly, faggoty Englishman, son of the mid-18th century Prime Minister, wrote a story about certain princes of Serendip. They set out to solve problems, but they never solved them because, on the way, they always came across something else, quite by accident, which diverted them. Hence the lovely and useful word serendipity. I might note here that almost all of these adventures in Unhistory were discovered via serendipity. I might note also that my Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, which defines serendipity as the gift of finding valuable or agreeable things not sought for, attributes the 3 princes of Serendip not to Walpole, but to a Persian fairy story. I discovered this whilst trying, quite uselessly, to discover the meaning of the word Dagoba. If this is not serendipity, then nothing is. Ceylon, a Buddhist country, among other things. Characteristic of Ceylonese Buddhism are immense sacred buildings, often painted white, and called dagobas. I wish I knew what the word really means. However, yes, many things might be said about the architecture of the dagoba, but I shall content myself with one. They all look the same, basically, like immense, gigantic, colossal eggs. And de Camp, from whom I have borrowed so freely, it makes no matter, we are friends, believes that the sight of one of these dagobas from a distant view of the old Ceylonese city of Anuradhapura may be one origin of the rock's egg. Sinbad was there, in Ceylon, remember? But as to how the Aepyornis, which, unlike the eagle, could not fly, and, unlike the great auk, could not swim, got from Madagascar to Ceylon, I can only answer in terms of another culture. Go no. Which leaves one more shoe for me to drop. We have established the locales of several places whither Sinbad sailed. More of them are to be found in one area than in any other one area, and that one is what we now call Indonesia. Borneo, Sumatra, Java, Celebes, and other islands. Indonesia is an ethnic affiliate of Malaysia. In fact, it was from either what is now Malaysia or what is now Indonesia, or both, that the original inhabitants of Madagascar came, sailing westward ho, o'er the white-waved seas of the immense blue Indian Ocean. Some of this voyaging may have been both back and forth to settle, and back to urge others to settle, and to show them the way thither. Was it then by way of these old-time Malaysian, Indonesian travellers and voyagers to and from Madagascar that the original Sinbad heard of the island where lived the giant bird which laid the giant eggs of the rock? I don't know, but I don't know what else. Do you?